All right, Chris Cox, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you got a book out called The Deadline Effect, How to Work Like It's the Last Minute Before the Last Minute. What got you thinking about the power of deadlines?
It really started with the career that I had for many years before I started writing this book, which was in the magazine business. And magazines run on deadlines and always have. And there's actually one particular problem that I was trying to figure out while I worked at a couple different magazines that motivated me. And the question I had is, why is it that every magazine I've ever worked at, we never miss a deadline? Like we've never missed a month if it's a monthly magazine. We never miss a week if it's a weekly magazine. How can these organizations be so consistent, even though, they have the same problems as any other workplace? They're lazy people, they're confused people, they're people who are, overburdened, and yet we consistently meet the monthly deadlines. And so that sort of kicked me off. That got me looking into it and trying to look into some of the psychology and the social science behind deadlines. And eventually, that led me to write this book.
Yeah, there's a surprising amount of research about deadlines. We're going to talk about some of that today. But let's talk about the word itself, deadline. It's pretty kind of a dark word. Where did it come from, and how did we make it be the thing that means like this is the due date? It's basically a due date, but we say deadline.
Yeah, it's a pretty gruesome sounding word, and it has the origin is actually related to death. We think that the word originated during the Civil War when prisoners of war in the stockade, there was a deadline surrounding the prison, and if a prisoner crossed that line, they'd be shot dead, and that was the deadline. And it sort of traveled its way over to the newspaper business, and a similar line on a printed page was called the deadline. And if you tried to print something outside that line, it wouldn't show up on the paper. So that's the line beyond which any text would die, metaphorically. So you couldn't put words there. And then because it was already in the newspaper business, it sort of morphed one more time to mean the time that you would have to file a story, or the time you would have to print a story. And then, it got adopted beyond that into the wider world, so that we all think of due dates as deadlines now.
Interesting. So let's talk about in general, like the research about the benefits of having a deadline. What do we know? And then we maybe drill into the specifics as we go on in this conversation.
Sure. Yeah. The first thing to say is simply that deadlines are remarkably effective. You may dread them. You may think that, I always blow my deadlines. But actually, when you dig into the social science and experimental evidence and even real world evidence, they work. They don't always work perfectly, and there's ways to tailor them to make them work better. But, the first thing you should do is just embrace the power of the deadline. I often say, the very worst deadline you can set for yourself is as soon as possible. In fact, you should set a concrete deadline, maybe down to a specific time for any project that you have. And just to name one quick and very simple experiment, some researchers had their students fill out a very long questionnaire. And it was not a huge task, but it took a little bit of time to fill out this questionnaire. And if they finished it, each student would get $5. And one group was given no deadline, and the other group was given, I believe, 3 weeks to finish it. And the group that had the deadline was 2.5 times more likely to finish the questionnaire, and 2.5 times more likely to get $5 from doing that. So, very, very simple, but just, a little bit of experimental evidence there that these things work. We should learn, if they work so well, we need to learn how to use them effectively.
We also highlight an example of deadlines being effective and helping us get things done with the U.S. Census. So I think we just did that, right? So you get that form in the mail, and there's sort of like a deadline, but it's way, way far away. And what ends up happening is it gets in your junk mail pile or like my bill pile, and you never do it. And so the government has to hire people to go door to door and do the census, and that just costs a lot of money. And so there's this person at the census who's like, maybe we can manipulate some deadlines here to get people to do these things sooner, so we don't have to go out knocking on their door. Can you tell us about that experiment?
Yeah. So this sort of feeds into my overall concept of deadlines, which is, first, they're effective, and second, that you can manipulate them. You can sort of tweak them to be more effective. And so that experiment was done by a census worker, and basically, everyone has gotten the postal questionnaire from the census. And if you fill that out, it's a lot cheaper for the government than it is if they have to send someone to your door to basically conduct the census face to face. And so they want to get as many people as possible to fill out that form. But like you said, it ends up on the junk pile. People ignore it. It gets lost, whatever. Or the people think they just have more time to do it and then don't do it. The census deadline passes. So this experiment by the census worker, her name was Elizabeth Martin, was again very simple. She just changed the deadline to be a week earlier for one group. So 2 sets of census forms went out. One people had a week less to finish it. And the somewhat counterintuitive result was that the people who got it, who had less time to finish it, were more likely to send it back. So the shorter deadline actually motivated people to get it done. And they also found that the quality of the census, how many questions they answered, how thorough they were, improved as well.
Okay, so I think we all understand that deadlines can be useful. We've probably all experienced our own lives, whether we were in school or at work. Are there downsides to deadlines?
Yeah, well, I mean, the name of the book is The Deadline Effect. And the deadline effect itself is a social science concept, and it's a negative thing. When economists talk about the deadline effect, what they mean is our tendency to delay the work to the last minute. So it often comes up in negotiations, like between a union or a corporation, for example. Like those deals usually get struck as the clock ticks down to 0. And there's a way in which the deadline itself incentivizes people to delay their work. And what I try to argue in the book is well, what if we took the power of the deadline effect? The deal gets done, the deal is reached on the courthouse steps. But what if we took that power, but manipulated it so that people could get things done earlier or more effectively or have more time to revise, all the things you want, rather than getting things done at the last minute. And so if you're prey to the deadline effect, the end result ends up usually being worse for all parties than it is if you've deliberately done your work productively all the way leading up to the deadline. So again, the book is about how to avoid that scenario.
Gotcha. And I think we've all experienced that too. If you were in college and you waited till the night before to write your term paper, well, it's probably a crappier term paper than if you'd started weeks before.
Yeah, no, it's not going to be as good. You're going to have typos. You're going to have errors. It's going to be not as carefully thought out as it would be if you had worked more deliberately toward that deadline. Absolutely. And as part of this book, I had to study a little bit of the psychology of procrastination. And one thing that I read was 20% of adults are considered chronic procrastinators. That means that they procrastinate on basically every project. But that number jumps up to 50% when you're in college. So we're particularly bad at regulating ourselves when it comes to deadlines when we're in college.
All right. So as you said in your book, you're trying to figure out how to get the benefits of the deadline, having that hard due date that can be motivating to get something done while mitigating the downside. So you're not getting that deadline effect where you just get crappy results because you're trying to rush to hit the deadline. So you start off the book with a case study from this chef named, I'm going to get his name right, Jean-Georges Vongerichten.
Pretty close, yeah. Jean-Georges Vongerichten. Yeah. His staff calls him JG, which keeps things simple.
All right,
yeah.
I'm going to call him JG.
There you go.
So JG, he's been able to figure out how to use deadlines to open up multiple 3-star Michelin restaurants, which is, for those who don't understand, it's hard just to get one restaurant to be a 3-star Michelin restaurant. This guy's done multiple. What's the system of deadlines that he's developed to allow him to do this without fail?
Yeah, he's got, I believe, 40, maybe it's more. 40 restaurants around the world. It was funny when I wrote this chapter, I had to keep updating that number because he kept opening up new restaurants. But yeah, these are high quality restaurants, gourmet dining. They get all the awards. And, that's a very difficult thing to do. Opening a restaurant is a very complicated process, but he's got a system and it works for him. And one of the most important things he does is setting interim deadlines along the way to opening a restaurant. So for the case study that I did, I embedded with his organization and reported on when he opened up 2 restaurants back to back, literally on a Tuesday and a Wednesday, and how he pulled that off. And the thing that I saw that was most important to both getting it done on time and getting it done at a high level of quality were these interim deadlines. In the restaurant world and with Jean-Georges, what that meant was he had what he called mock services. Other restaurants do this too, but he did it very methodically. Every single night, starting 2 months before the proposed opening date, he would start basically trying to run the restaurant as if it was already open. And at first that meant that he would serve meals to the staff, or the chefs and the staff that was there would serve it to the rest of the staff. And then they would start dragging in more people. So people from his larger organization, then eventually they would get the construction companies executives to come in and dine. And each of those served as a little interim deadline on the way to that real actual opening date. And they got to improve the quality of the dining experience every time. And they would tweak and tweak and tweak and learn something from each deadline along the way. And it meant that when opening day arrived, it wasn't this frenzied rush. It was like, oh, this is just another night in this restaurant that's already kind of been operating for a couple of months now.
Okay, so I guess the takeaway from there on how to use deadlines while mitigating the deadline effect is have multiple deadlines, not just a single deadline, but multiple.
Yeah, these interim deadlines, these sort of like checkpoints along the way, are very effective. And there was an experiment done by Dan Ariely, who wrote the book Predictably Irrational, who talks a lot about these sort of things, like how to sort of work with our built-in biases. So he did an experiment wherein he had his students, I'm trying to remember exactly how it worked. He had 3 groups of students, and they all had to turn in 3 term papers during a class. And one group was given no deadline, so they could basically turn in all 3 papers on the last day of class. The other was told to submit them at equal intervals throughout the semester. So, one third of the way through, 2/3 of the way through, and one at the very end. And the other got to choose. Like they could either space them out or they could just put them all in the last day. And then he graded all the papers and found something that might not surprise you, which is that the people with evenly spaced deadlines did the best. The people who waited to the last day of class to turn in all 3 papers did the worst. But another interesting finding was that those that got to choose their own deadline, if they chose evenly spaced deadlines, did as well as the people with the mandatory ones.
All right, multiple deadlines, you're going to get a better product, and you're just going to get a better product, and you're going to be less stressed about it. But here's the tricky part. I think we've probably, if you went to college, you probably had some study skills class where they told you guys set multiple deadlines for your term paper. You know that logically, and you say, okay, I'm going to implement this. So you start planning things out. You're like, okay, I'm going to get my final papers due here. I'm going to do a deadline here, and then another deadline here. But then you start working on the thing, and you're like, man, this is taking longer than I thought it was going to take. Basically, we discovered we're really bad at planning.
Mm-hmm.
So why are we so bad at planning? And then how can you avoid setting deadlines you can't meet?
Yeah, we're bad at planning. I mean, I think it's just another one of those built-in biases that humans have. There's a name for it. It's called the planning fallacy. It is a product of actually our optimism. Like we always think that we're going to get things done faster and for lower cost than we actually get them done. The classic example of the planning fallacy is the Sydney Opera House, which when it was first designed, they had a planned timeline of 6 years to complete it and a budget of 7 million Australian dollars. And it actually took 16 years and cost $102 million.
Wow.
And so researchers have studied this problem and tried to figure out solutions to it. And the solution, again, it's very sort of straightforward, but it's amazing how powerful it is. And it's simply to think about the last time you did a similar project and try to remember how long that took. And that's how you set the timeline for your new project. So the last time you wrote a 10-page term paper, it took you, you thought it was going to take you 2 weeks. It took you 6 weeks. Okay, well, if you have to budget your time, plan for 6 weeks for that. And just that little nudge, that little bit of deliberate thinking is enough to help you plan effectively. It help you vanquish this planning fallacy.
Well, another thing you highlight too that can help vanquish it is instead of planning left to right, plan right to left. What do you mean by that?
Right. So, this is when you have a situation where basically you don't get to set the deadline, but you have a mandatory deadline that you have to meet. In the book, I talk about 2 different organizations that have this happen to them regularly. One is Airbus, the aerospace company. They promise a jet to, United Airlines. They have to deliver by that date or there are actually huge penalties. And so the way they get around the planning fallacy, the way they make sure that they deliver on time and don't run over like the Sydney Opera House is they plan right to left. So they get out their calendar and they know the end date. and they work left on the calendar, they work backwards in time to plan each stage. And, again, sort of remembering how long did it take us to do this phase last time, all the way back, and then use that as their guide for keeping on target. And then the other organization was, I went and spent a few weeks with 4 family farms in Northern California and Southwestern Oregon that provide all the Easter lilies that are sold in the United States and Canada every year. Easter lily is a white lily, and it really is only bought and sold for Easter, for the Easter weekend. And so one of the farmers told me basically the day after Easter, this crop is useless. So they really have to meet that deadline. They have to have the lilies ready to ship in time for the holiday. And they did the same thing. They really carefully planned out their year and knew down to the day, like how long each stage of the process would take, harvest. There's a period when the bulbs are stored in a warehouse. There's a period when it goes into a greenhouse, and they plan backwards from that. And that tells them basically when to plant, when to harvest. And that's how they meet their deadline year after year.
Yeah, I picked up on that right to left planning when I was in law school, like getting ready for exams. Because, in law school, your entire grade for the semester depends on this one single exam you take. It's an essay exam with some multiple choice. And so what I did is, I would, at the beginning of the semester, I'd say, okay, the test is this date. And then I would schedule out, okay, I'm going to do a practice test this Saturday before, and then this Saturday before. And it was amazing how much that helped in me getting ready for those law school exams.
Yeah, no, exactly. If you work the other way, you're much more likely to spill past the date that you actually need to get it done.
Right. So another thing you argue is to think of deadlines as some deadlines, not all deadlines, but some deadlines as a soft open with teeth. What do you mean by that?
Right. So deadlines, no matter what kind they are effective. But even if they're self-imposed, even if it's just you sitting and thinking to yourself, I'm going to get it done by this Friday at 5 p.m. or whatever, that helps. But the more, what I call enforcement mechanisms you can work in, the better for you, the more likely it is you're actually going to get it done. And so a soft deadline with teeth is basically, it's a real deadline in that there are some consequences if you miss it, but it is before the most important deadline, the sort of do or die date. And so the case study I did for that is I went to Telluride ski resort in Colorado and watched how they open the mountain for the season. And basically, that involves spinning up a lot of different parts of the organization. They have to hire lifties, people to run the lifts. They have to hire ski instructors. And then most importantly, they have to cover the entire mountain in snow. A lot of the early season is only possible because of artificial snowmaking. And the way that they have made sure that they open successfully is by setting a soft deadline with teeth. So in the ski business, the first big weekend is the week between Christmas and New Year's. And that's the week that you have to have everything up and running full speed if you are going to meet your revenue for the year. They have to have, that's the busiest week of the entire ski season. So that's the real deadline. That's the do or die date for Telluride. So they decided, okay, fine. Well, if we want to make sure that we're completely ready by that date, when should we open? And for the past, more than a decade, they've opened on Thanksgiving. And the way they thought it was, that's a real deadline. There are going to be real people skiing on the mountain that day if we announce that we're open. Those are the teeth. But if we miss it, or if the experience isn't 100% or whatever, we still have several more weeks to dial things in and improve the resort before the do or die date of the Christmas holiday.
How do you think just regular people can implement this in their workaday life, like soft openings with teeth?
Well, I mean, I did a version of this one for my book. Basically, I promised my agent and my wife that I would give them the book about a month before it was due to the publisher. And that's not the strongest set of enforcement. My wife would probably forgive me if I missed my deadline, but that I had that deadline in mind, and I gave her something on that date. It's like, please read this, and it helped keep me sort of on target for my real deadline, which is when I had to give it to my publisher.
So something you point out in the book, setting deadlines for some projects can be pretty straightforward. I'm thinking, in your business, like the magazine business, as an editor, you had the final deadline was to print, right? That was the ultimate deadline. 'Cause you had to get
Hmm.
ship out the thing. But before that, there's these other deadlines. There's the layout, there's the photography, and then there was the copy editing, and then the editing, and then the fact checking, and then you working with the writer, editing their stuff. So it's complicated, but it can be pretty linear. There are some tasks, however, some projects that aren't as linear, like they're complex. There's a lot of moving parts that are interacting in unpredictable ways. How do you set deadlines for those types of projects?
Well, I think there's a few different strategies you can use. One is to use those interim deadlines to sort of, okay, I'm planning right to left. Here's this huge project. I know I have to get these 10 things done, and just set individual deadlines for each of them. The other, I guess, bias to be aware of is something called the mere urgency effect, which is our tendency to prioritize whatever is due next, whatever has the closest deadline. That's fine if you're not overloaded, but if you are, it means you're going to start doing things that are unnecessary at the expense of those that are much more important. And so the researchers that study this effect talk about what's called outcome salience. So when you think about any part of this project, think about, okay, if I get this done, what is the outcome going to be? Like, how important is that towards the final end goal that I have? And the way that the case study I attached to this bias that we have was I embedded in a presidential campaign as a long shot presidential candidate for the Democratic primary named John Delaney. Great guy. Let me sort of tag along with him in Iowa for several days. And running for president is extremely complicated. Like, there's a million different things. You hire staff all over the country. But because he was this long shot candidate, he actually was very effective. I mean, he knew that his only chance was to sort of strip down his operation to the essentials. And so his goal was to get to the first debate. So you had to qualify for the first debate by getting 1% in 3 different polls. Which doesn't sound hard, but actually, if you're sort of someone that people don't know about, if you're not, Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden, it can be difficult to even get 1%. And so he sort of set aside everything else that had to do with campaigning and focused only on this one goal: 3 polls, 1%. And the way he figured out how to do that was, forget about, going to other states in the country. I'm going to focus only on Iowa because that's where they do the most polling. And I'm going to go to every county in Iowa, and I bet you if I shake enough hands, I could probably get this 1% in 3 different polls in this one state. So he really, really prioritized what he was doing. And it worked. I mean, he got those 3 polls. He was on the first debate stage, and that was his best shot. If he had broken out during that debate, then he would have been a viable candidate. I mean, he would have made it farther than he did. But, he did not do as well on the debate stage as he wanted to. And so he did not make it too much farther.
Well, so that's another benefit of deadlines right there. When you're facing a project that just seems overwhelming, a deadline for him, the deadline was, I got to get this percentage of poll, like 1% poll by this deadline so I can get on the stage for the debate. It can add some clarity and give you some focus, and you feel less overwhelmed.
Yeah, exactly. It was sort of like a filter to apply to any question that came across his desk. It's like, will this get me closer to that goal? And if the answer is no, then he would decline that invitation or whatever it was. So actually, before the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, announced that they were going to have this criteria for the debate, the 1% criterion, he was a lot more all over the place. He was like, he went to, the South, he went to the West Coast, he went all over the place. But as soon as they announced that, he was like, I'm in Iowa every day as much as I can be.
And if he was being led astray by the mere urgency effect, he would have kept going to all those different places. He's like, well, that's what you're supposed to do. Like, they're having this thing in California now, I need to be there.
Yeah.
But instead he just said, no, it might be urgent, but it's not important. I got to focus on Iowa. That's my only, that's the thing that's going to give me at least a shot.
Exactly. Like he told me before that those new debate rules were set up, his plan was to do a 50-state bus tour. And that's exactly the thing that you should not be doing if you're trying to get 3 Iowa polls. So he canceled that and focused on his ground game in Iowa.
Okay. So I think the takeaway there, if you have an overwhelming project, figure out what's the most important thing, the thing that's going to get you closer to your goal, and don't get sucked in doing that stuff that you think you're supposed to be doing because it seems like it's urgent or other people are doing it.
Yeah, just apply the question of, does this get me closer to my final goal, to basically every task that you see.
Another case study you looked at on organizations that use deadlines to make things happen is the theater, the world
Mm-hmm.
of theater. And it's very similar as I was reading, like this is just like opening a restaurant in a lot of ways.
Yeah, there is that same sort of like deliberate practice phase. I mean, in theater, it's much more formalized. We know the language of it better because everyone's heard of rehearsals and then dress rehearsals and then opening night and all that. But yeah, looking at theaters, I went to the opening of one play at the Public Theater in New York. I sort of saw how much they had built in of like a system, a very deliberate process to make sure that they hit all their marks, that things improved at the right pace, so that when it was opening night, that the play would be ready to go on.
And like you use this to explore this idea of using deadlines to improve what psychologists called sense-making or understanding. Just basically get a better grasp of what's going on in your project.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the all right, this is going to sound sarcastic, but one of the joys of researching this book is I got to read all sorts of interesting publications. And I read one paper in a publication called Administrative Science Quarterly, not a magazine I would normally read. And it talked about this idea of sense making and updating. So sense making is simply pausing and creating a space and a deliberate time to sort of assess how things are going. So in the theater, that means at the end of every rehearsal, the director gives notes. He says, all right, today, this scene was working, this scene was not, here's what was wrong about it. That's sense making. That's looking at how your project is going and figuring out what's working and what's not. And then updating is simply what you do in response to that. It's like, okay, well, if this scene is a little bit slow, then let's speed it up. Or if it needs more energy, let's add more energy. So, and if you, in this article in Administrative Science Quarterly, they talked about sense making and updating in the operating room. And some surgeons regularly pause, even though it's very tense and there's a lot of adrenaline flowing in an emergency situation. But the surgeons who are able to pause and take stock of the situation, see what's going right with the patient, see what's going wrong, and then update their behavior accordingly are much more successful and have fewer deaths than those who sort of charge ahead and either just act purely on instinct the whole time or just don't stop and take stock of the situation regularly.
Something that surprised me with the theater was how close to the deadline, the final deadline, opening night, they were updating things.
Mm-hmm.
In some cases, it would be like the night before. They like, I think Hello Dolly. You gave the example of Hello Dolly,
right?
I think it's one of the all-time greatest, best-selling Broadway musicals. And the song that's everyone knows Hello Dolly for, it was like written like the week before, or just a few nights before the play went on.
Yeah, I mean, that was a show that got updated continually throughout the whole process before it went to Broadway. And yeah, they wrote one of the most famous songs. Actually, it's probably the second most famous song from Hello Dolly. Most famous is Hello Dolly, but there's a song called Before the Parade Passes By. And they wrote it the night before the performance. And at 3 a.m, the composer was in his hotel room. Carol Channing, who is the actress, was there too. And the director was there. And then they wrote it on the spot, or the composer wrote it on the spot, and they performed it. And then they sort of knew they had a hit on their hands right there and danced around the room saying, that's it. Yeah, I mean, so what does that have to do with sense making and updating? It's like they saw the audience like growing a little bit bored in the middle of the musical. And they said, okay, we need to solve this problem. And they stayed up all night solving it. And then, the rest is history. It became a total smash hit.
And they wouldn't have figured it out if they didn't have those multiple deadlines, those multiple practice runs that had deadlines themselves. They wouldn't be able to.
Yeah,
they wouldn't be able to.
Exactly.
Figure that out.
Well, I mean, you can imagine a scenario in which if the theater didn't work the way that it does, you have a lousy performance, and if there wasn't this system in place where basically everyone sits around after it and gives notes and talks about what went right and what went wrong, people would just say, like, oh, well, that was bad. Maybe tomorrow will be better. And they don't change anything. So because the theater has such a sort of codified system of sense making. That's why, that play was successful and why so many plays are successful. The system creates the success.
So one of my favorite parts of the book, you went undercover with Best Buy. You became an employee at Best Buy. This is sort of like, what's her name? The nickel and dime lady. Barbara
Ehrenreich.
Ehrenreich,
A
yes.
huge inspiration. Yeah.
Right. So you did this. You got a job at Best Buy, but it was the weeks before just Black Friday. What were you hoping to learn about deadlines by working for Best Buy during Black Friday?
Well, so Black Friday was the deadline that I was interested in. It's like, oh, this is the biggest sales day of the year for Best Buy and for a lot of retailers. And it's a pretty dramatic change in business as usual. So, an average day at Best Buy, or at the store I ended up working at, sales are at 1/10 of what they are on Black Friday. So how do you prepare for 10 times the number of customers, 10 times the number of revenue on a single day? And I love Barbara Ehrenreich, and she went to go work for like a Home Depot type store for her book. But at first I tried to go in through the front door. I called Best Buy and said, I want to come look at what you do to prepare. But they just, they didn't really respond. And after about a year of waiting and asking, I was like, all right, well, I got to try a different way to report this story. And so I applied for a job. I applied to work at a store out on Long Island in New York. And I got the job, thank goodness, and joined the staff. I joined the TV department, or the home theater department, as we called it. And I learned to sell flat screen TVs and speakers, and then got to watch what happened when Black Friday itself rolled around. I had about 3 weeks on the job before I was thrown into the total chaos well, not total chaos, but the high stakes situation of Black Friday.
And so what do they do? I mean, what did their process look like leading up to Black Friday to get ready for it? Did they have multiple deadlines? I mean, did they do the same sort of things we've been talking about?
Yes, some of that. They have a big sort of dry run, so that it's a little bit like a soft deadline with Teats. So they gather the whole staff, I think it was 2 weeks before Black Friday, and sort of run through how the day is going to work. But the most important thing they do is they rebuild the store basically to handle this big deadline. So normally, the store is, you can freely walk from one part to the other, but to handle the crowds on Black Friday, they divide it into sections. So computers has its own checkout and its own sort of roped off area, and TVs have their own area, and appliances and mobile devices and gaming. And that's mainly for crowd control, to keep people flowing. And the things that you see on the news where people get trampled or the big crowd is crashing through the doors, that's what they're trying to avoid. And that's one strategy they use to do that. The other thing they did, so there's a school of social science that talks about what's called interdependence. So it's how much a store or any organization, how much the employees rely on each other to complete their tasks. So Best Buy normally is had pooled interdependence. So basically every employee was working for himself or herself, and their sales were tracked separately. On Black Friday, and only for Black Friday, they changed that system so that there are no track sales. Every employee relies on the other employees to complete a sale. So it's basically impossible to sell a TV to someone all the way through. So you have to hand it off from one employee to the next in order to complete the process. And so by increasing interdependence within the store, the whole store becomes more efficient, and they have to be efficient on that day, or else they're not going to get through the day. They're not going to serve every customer that wants to buy something.
So how was working at Best Buy on Black Friday? Was it exhausting?
It was absolutely exhausting. Best Buy controlled the process about as well as they could, but you're still dealing with thousands of people, and it's tough. It's a long shift. There's no downtime. You basically are fighting off one customer to serve the other, or having to say, please wait 1 minute again and again and again to everyone. But eventually we made our way all the way through. And also Black Friday has sort of expanded its reach so that it takes over half of Thanksgiving too. So when I worked there, I started on Thanksgiving afternoon and then worked all the way through about 2 a.m. that night. And then the next day came in the morning and worked that full Black Friday. And yeah, by the end, I was ready to tender my resignation.
And do they do an after action report afterwards? So here's what went well, here's what went bad that we can change for next year?
They don't do that with the regular employees, but the management team does that. And then they definitely do it at that sort of dry run meeting that comes right before Black Friday. They said, okay, last year, this is what happened. Last year, these were our numbers. And though that's one other thing that's worth mentioning about Best Buy and Black Friday is they set goals for themselves on how much they want to sell. And they make them difficult and concrete. And there's a lot of evidence that from this field called goal setting theory, that those are crucial insights to have. You can't just say, we want to sell as many TVs as possible. You have to say, like, no, we want to sell this number of TVs, and then make that target, a real number, but also a little bit of a reach. And that is a way to motivate your employees. It's a way to sort of meet the goal that you want to reach.
Yeah, we see that with JFK and his moonshot, right? Choose to go to the moon in this decade.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think that when he said that, people were probably saying that's impossible. That's a very tight deadline. And yet, because he set that deadline, I mean, they did it in July of 1969, right? So they just got it in pretty much under the wire. And I think there's something about the audacity of that goal, how hard it was, that motivated NASA and everyone else to get it done.
So you end the book talking about a type of deadline that I never heard of, but I'm intrigued by it. It's called stochastic deadlines. What are stochastic deadlines?
Stochastic is just like a fancy economist word for random. And so I was reading papers back to the deadline effect, the negative version of it. I was reading some economic papers, and there was one that talked about the effect of a stochastic deadline on the deadline effect. So basically, let's say you have a negotiation, if you impose a deadline that's triggered by an event that will happen at a random time, the deadline effect basically disappears.
So what's an example of that?
Well, so this economist talked about online auctions, like eBay type auctions. And if the deadline for the end of the auction was somewhat random, like if neither party could know exactly when it would end, they were more likely to find the final agreed upon price quickly, because they knew they couldn't wait to the last minute. And so, what does that have to do with everyday life? Well, to talk about that, I went and embedded with a unit of the Air Force called the 621st Contingency Response Wing. And they're basically the disaster preparedness gurus of the Air Force. They are the unit that you send in if there's a hurricane or if there's an earthquake anywhere in the world. And basically, their job is first and foremost to arrive and set up an airfield so that relief supplies can start flying in. And so that's a hard job. That's very complicated. It could be dangerous. But when I was there, I was there right before a hurricane hit. Hurricane Florence was making its way towards the East Coast. Everyone on base was totally relaxed, totally chill. And I eventually figured out, these things are connected. This is a stochastic deadline. This is a random deadline. Like this, we never know when an earthquake is going to strike. You never know exactly when a hurricane is going to develop. And so the solution that this unit of the Air Force hit upon was to just maintain a very well-defined system of preparedness so that they were ready to deploy it at any moment. And so that was it. I was witnessing, the deadline effect being vanquished by this random deadline.
Have you been able to implement stochastic or random deadlines in your own life?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the lesson that I took away from that Air Force unit was basically like to try to remain in this high state of preparedness and productivity consistently. So it's not that, deadlines in my own life have become random. It's just that if you apply all the lessons of meeting deadlines that I learned from the book and consistently throughout your life, then you never feel stressed. You never feel crunched. You're always on top of things.
And I mean, have your deadline setting, has it gotten better since you wrote this book? I mean, you were pretty good at it as an editor. You had to be, but has it gotten better?
Yeah, I think it was becoming a magazine editor that made me good at it. I've gotten better by doing this research. In college, I was as miserable as all the rest of us, or almost. I was frequently working up into the last minute. I think it was working as an editor that really made me appreciate both like the power of the deadline and also the way you can use systems to force yourself, to get things done on time. The biggest change for me from reading this book was that insight from the census is that if you set a deadline uncomfortably close, if you shorten a deadline, you're more likely to finish it. And so that actually influenced my deadline for the book. I picked a date that felt just a little bit on the edge of my comfort when I was going to turn it in. And I think that helped me. It meant that I couldn't drag things out. It meant that I had to plan the whole thing out very deliberately, doing that right to left planning. And writing a book is a big project, but I got it done on time. And that is actually fairly rare in the book world. So I was glad that I had read the research that I had to make it possible.
And what do you think, if someone's listening to this podcast right now, what's one thing that you think they can start implementing today where they'll see, an immediate result with how they create or craft their deadlines?
Well, if you're setting a deadline for yourself, again, the first step is to make it a concrete deadline. Don't say as soon as possible. Pick a date, pick a time. You could learn from the planning fallacy and think about the last time you did something that was similar, and then sort of working in the opposite direction from that optimism, then push the deadline forward. Set it a little bit earlier than you think you might want to. And that is simply that's going to be that nudge that pushes you into action sooner rather than later.
Well, Chris, this has been a great conversation. Where can people go to learn more about the book and your work?
Well, the book is available from bookstores everywhere, or Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And if they want to check out my website, there's more information there. That's deadlineeffect.com.
Fantastic. Well, Chris Cox, thanks for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Brett. Good to be with you.
My guest today was Chrisopther Cox. He's the author of the book, The Deadline Effect. It's available on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere. You can find out more information about the book at the website deadline-effect.com. Also, check out our show notes at aom.is/deadline, where you find links to resources when you delve deeper into this topic.